and it's my pleasure to welcome Dean Lapidus. He is the Dean of the College of Business Administration at the California State Polytechnic University, a 25,000 students campus, and the college that the Dean is leading, it's about 4,500 students. And Dean Lapidus got his PhD from University of Nebraska in marketing, and let's welcome him and let's listen carefully.
Thank you, Nelu. Actually, for me, it was yesterday. So I arrived yesterday afternoon, and I guess I've been here about 5 hours today. So that's my knowledge of UW Stout, other than the research on the website. I was asked to, and by the way, I have to tell you that to the one, it doesn't matter whether it's the community or students, faculty, staff. I mean, the degree of pride for this institution just flows out. I mean, from an outsider's perspective, extremely encouraging. You know, nothing worse than walking into an environment where everyone's hostile and nothing but grumbling and dissent. And although I know that the world is not perfect here, really positive feedback. So I thank you for that. So I was asked to talk for a bit today about building bridges, and it's a really good topic and a really powerful metaphor. And so as I was thinking about what I wanted to say, the first thing that came to mind was to think about what in fact is a bridge. And so in thinking about what a bridge is something a structure that connects two endpoints. And sometimes those endpoints are similar, and sometimes they're vastly different. But we create that structure as a means of overcoming some sort of obstacle. It's a deep gorge, a raging river, whatever it is, we need to figure out a way to get to the other side. And when we put those 2 points together, we form new relationships, and the environment changes. The relationships create a new landscape for us. But in thinking about bridges, sometimes bridges can be scary. Because there's an element of trust required to walk across that bridge. And so we need to think a little bit about that trust factor as we have conversations today. But ultimately, if we don't walk across that bridge, then there's an opportunity lost, and forward progress is impeded. So that was really sort of the foundation for my thinking and putting together the rest of my comments. So I want to start sort of macro and then get a little bit more micro in terms of bridges and collaborations that we might think about. And I thought maybe as a starting point, you know, how does the chancellor play a role in this? What is the relationship to the campus? What's the foundation? And it seems to me as though the chancellor's responsibility is to create engagement on campus. We want strong collaboration. We want people to be committed and interested in participating in whatever the agenda is, and understand that their participation is valued. That's the key. And I think that a number of things have to happen for us to make forward progress. And so I think, number one, there needs to be strong communication, and that communication needs to be two-way. The more communication there is, the greater the transparency. The more transparency, the greater the trust. And trust, again, is sort of a common theme that runs through this whole conversation. I think it's important that communication come from all quarters of the campus. You know, anyone can have a good idea. One thing that you'll find out about me if I wind up with this position is that I'm not really enamored by titles and rank. I think that it's the ideas that count and how people express them that ultimately are important. I think it's important that the conversations can be such that they're frank and candid and people can express their viewpoint irrespective of whether it's the mainstream viewpoint or not. Back on my campus, I oftentimes advocate for healthy disagreement. I think it produces a richer environment, and ultimately at the end we wind up with better solutions if we hear all the viewpoints. So communication critical. Number two, I think that there needs to be a high level of integrity and that there needs to be a shared value system. I think we all have to have an important agreement on what the foundation for our thinking is. Vibrant universities have lots of opportunities that come at them. But how do we prioritize those opportunities? The value system and the belief structure guides that conversation. And then thirdly, I think there needs to be a collaborative vision. We need to have a full understanding, the campus has to have a full understanding of where we're headed and how we're going to get there. And if we have all of those pieces in place, then I think strategic planning, building that blueprint from how to get to point A, from point A to point B, becomes much clearer, and it's generally agreed upon. If people are in agreement with the direction the campus is going, they're going to be much more likely committed to the long-term betterment of the institution. So with that said, let me talk a little bit more micro now about some of the things that I think are important. And again, my disclaimer here is that I don't have all the facts, so if you're doing these things already, that's great. Maybe we can strengthen them, but I just want to give you a sense of how I think and what I think is important, and then we can have a conversation. So my first couple of items fall under the general heading of enhancing the student experience. And I think that one of the areas that I'm really keen on is strategic planning and making sure that strategic plans that exist across divisions and units don't miss the boundary spanning opportunities. I think that sometimes by nature of strategic planning, we plan within our own units and we measure against the metrics, but we don't often think about what's going on in other divisions very often. In fact, I challenge you to think about your strategic plan and how many of your goals emphasize participation with another unit. I'm guessing not very many. And so I think by creating a more seamless campus, the experience will be more beneficial to the students. We tend to look through different lenses. You know, you're in your unit, you're doing a great job, and that's your barometer. But the students look through a different lens. Their lens is more holistic. And so if it's not seamless, they pick up on that. And so I think that there is important value to thinking about that. I'll make up an example, and I'm sure I'll be wrong, but here we go. So as an example, if academic affairs was responsible for the development of first-year experience courses, and let's say housing decides to take on an initiative for living learning communities, might it not be better if they planned those two activities together? We get a Gestalt effect. The sum is greater, the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. It's a more fulfilling experience for students. And so I think that's sort of the spirit of this. And why am I talking about this? Well, because the things that we measure on campus are things like enrollment, retention, persistence, graduation. And the national data overwhelmingly suggests that students that persist and graduate are students that have both high-quality programs and lots of co-curricular activities where there's lots of touch points, and then a service environment that pulls it all together. So having that seamless environment for them, I think, greatly enhances the experience. I'll give you one other non-academic related example, but just to give you a sense that this is happening in other industries besides education, an increased thought process about thinking more holistically. So I had an opportunity this last year to do a consulting project with the National Football League. And I spent a week in New York at the Super Bowl. It was tough duty, but someone had to do it. And so you might initially say, well, you know, why? I mean, the NFL is interested in managing and understanding the fan experience. Well, what's there to understand? I buy a ticket, I go to the stadium, I watch the game, I'm happy if my team wins, I'm not so happy if they lose, and I go home. But it's not like that. They understand that there is this much more holistic evaluation that takes place that drives people back to these events, particularly if you're paying a large amount of money. So what did we research? Well, we researched how friendly was the host city, how was the transportation around the city, what was parking like, how were the concession stands, was the food hot if it was supposed to be hot, was it reasonably priced, were the restrooms clean? All of those things go into making up the totality of your experience that day at that event. And I think for students, the same sort of thing happens. When all the pieces are integrated properly, then their experience is very different than if it's disjointed. So that's point number one. I think that we'd like to think a little bit more about academic programming. I really like the programming here. I love the Polytech philosophy. As Nelu said, I'm at a Polytech now. I like the hands-on, applied, interdisciplinary piece, high levels of technology, great interface with the community for building experience portfolios when come time to graduation. But maybe there's still opportunities to refine more. You know, when I look at the national unemployment data, what I see is that unemployment is still reasonably high, but when you go out and you talk to firms, they tell you they have jobs. They have jobs and they have good paying jobs, but they can't find employees to meet those jobs. Well, that's a part of a new conversation. What is it that is going on with the curriculum that's not providing the skill sets necessary to meet those job opportunities? It's also an opportunity, I think, to have a broader-based conversation about what the future of those industry looks like. You know, it's one thing to make an immediate contribution to industry now, but I think that the next step is to think about how we can be thought leaders in shaping those industries moving forward. Can we produce students now that are going to help those firms be successful 10 years from now? That's when the educational piece really will start to click here and at other institutions as well. Another piece I think that we need to think a little bit about is the diversity piece. I think that diversity in the community, the campus community and beyond, is critically important. That it's important that students, that it's important that all of us here understand the value and the enrichment that comes from a diverse population. We live in a diverse cultural world, and it's important that our students understand how to interact with that diversity, however it might be defined. And I think that it's important that we have conversations not just about representativeness, but rather conversations about inclusion. So it's one thing to say, well, I have 5% of this population and 8% of the other population and so on, and that's a start. But really, inclusiveness is about making sure that all of those populations have a voice and that they can be heard, and their perspective, their unique perspective, enriches the overall conversation. And then I think we can start to have, again, a real conversation about the importance of diversity. Let me change gears for a second, and of course we can come back and talk about any of these things. And talk for a minute about some categories that I have listed under what I might call deepening university engagement. And so now I want to take us off campus a little bit and talk about that for a couple of minutes. First of all, I think the alumni base. There's about 70 some odd thousand, I think, alums. And the question is, how often do we talk to them? And what do we talk to them about? And how deep and meaningful are those conversations? It's important, I think, for universities to view alumni as an extended family. They never go away. And there's constant need for touch points. I think that universities that have not spent a lot of time thinking about advancement and the development of external constituencies seem to think that they can just go out and ask people for stuff. And it doesn't work that way. The relationship has to be grown over time. And I would argue that the alumni conversation should start when the students are still here on campus. It should be woven into the fabric of what the campus does, so that there is an expectation that they will be part of this larger community. And when the time comes for them to help, we might ask for their assistance. In the meantime, we should be providing opportunities to continue to help them to be successful. Because if they're successful, then ultimately they will give back. So I arrived 5 years ago at Cal Poly, and it was the beginning of a capital campaign. The goal was to raise $150 million, which we have exceeded. But a big part of it was talking to alums. And it's a really hard conversation when you pick up the phone and you introduce yourself, and the first thing they say back to you is, "Where have you been for the last 30 years?" And you know then that there is a phenomenal amount of cultivation that's going to be needed to bring that person back into the fold. That should never happen. And so I think that we need to give some thought, if not already, to how we have more meaningful relationships with our alumni base. All of the other educational entities, I think, out there are also important groups to talk to. How does this campus interact with other campuses? How do we interact with the president? How do we interact with regents and other people that are part of the system? It's important that they understand what we do here, why we're different, what our needs are, so that ultimately they can be a voice for us when they're out in the community. So I think that's an important bridge. We have the technical schools and the community college. The technical schools I'm a little less familiar with. They don't exist on the West Coast. We're a conglomerate of a large group. I think there's 123 or 128 community colleges in California that are feeders to the system schools. But nonetheless, what kinds of conversations can we have with them? How can we find ways to share resources? How can we help them to better prepare students so that they arrive here without the need for extra credit hours or taking a sidestep for remediation? So what are the expectations coming in here so that they will be up and ready to go, so that when we promise them that they can graduate in a timely fashion, we in fact can honor that promise. I think those are important conversations. K through 12. I spend a fair amount of time in K through 12, talking to students interfacing with them, sharing them with them some of the possibilities for a curriculum that they haven't even imagined. There are feeders. I want them to think about our institution as they're going through, particularly in communities that are underrepresented. In those underrepresented communities, they're not talking about college. They're not talking about it in the classroom. They're not talking about it in their homes. They're not talking about it in their communities. And we try to get students fired up, and they do. We bring curriculum to them. We find opportunities to bring large groups to campus, to get involved in exercises. For example, in the College of Business, we have quite a large cybersecurity program. We've turned it into games. You know, we can defend attackers. It's like a video game for them, and they get all excited. These little, you know, I don't know what age they are. They're fifth graders or whatever. I mean, they're wow, gaming. It's school time. We get to play games. But they start to think about the possibilities. It's a whole new world for them. I'll give you another example that was really kind of fun. About 2 weeks ago, we have a music industry program, and we've been going into the grade schools. And over the period of time that we've been there, the last couple of years, we've tripled the number of grade schoolers that are now picking up and playing musical instruments. And we had a rare opportunity to bring the John Lennon mobile recording studio to campus. It's very hard to get. It's this giant recording studio that's in a bus, and it's got all the latest and greatest equipment. And the first thing we did was we invited all these kids to come on, bring your instruments, come on to campus. We're going to match you up with our orchestra, and we're going to do some recording. And we sent them home with CDs. I guarantee you that there were some life-changing moments there. You know, we're in the life-changing business, and it starts young, and I think that those are really, really important conversations to have if they're not already happening. And then finally, you know, I think that the campus has a responsibility to educate the public at large. You know, what is it that public education is all about? How can we touch the right people across the state and across the right industries to be advocates for us? You know, it's not clear always that the population understands what it is we do and the value of a public good. What they generally hear about is that education is a cost center. And rarely does the conversation ever switch around the other way and talk about value added. And so I think it's important that people understand what we're producing and why it's important. If we have a more educated population, then we have better jobs, higher salaries, tax-based changes, all kinds of ripple effect, and that's a critical conversation. I think similarly for some of our legislators, at least in California, it's clear that they really don't understand education. They're happy to make policy, but it's not clear that they understand education. And so again, talking to that group, I think, is important. And then finally, and I know I'm running long here, you know, I think that it was my impression, and I think confirmed by many that I've talked to thus far, that we need to have some conversations about the finances that are going to fuel the campus and make it better moving forward. I think we're probably all in agreement that the budget, no matter whatever the high point in Wisconsin ever was, is never going to get back there. We are going to be funded less and less, and we're going to be increasingly independent. And so we need to find other means of backfilling the lost resources and start thinking about how we're going to get to that next level of excellence with resources that come from other places. I've seen a smattering of capital, but not capital campaign, but fundraising efforts across the website. But I think that it needs to be more centralized and focused. It needs to be part of a formalized engagement plan. There probably needs to be some conversation about a capital campaign and understand what kinds of resources the colleges and other units need, and then make a concerted effort to start moving in that direction. It's challenging, but I think if the story is compelling and the vision is right, that people will step up. Again, Cal Poly Pomona, I arrived 5 years ago. They had never become involved in a capital campaign before. We set the target at $150 million. As I said, we exceeded it. It came from all kinds of places, some of them unexpected, some of them expected, but people stepped up. Again, it's about educating them about the value of education, about what we're delivering, and it's possible. So I don't know what that dollar amount would be here. You bring in a consultant and you look at the capacity of your donor base, and you look at the soundness of the relationships that exist with corporations and foundations that are already established, and then you set a number. But it's certainly doable. Campuses all across the country are doing so, and their citizenry is stepping up and in support. So that's another important conversation. So with that, I will stop, and we can do whatever you'd like with the remaining time.
All right, let's thank our speaker.